Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Kerry Baker with Hill and Ponton, and today with me is Ursula Mecabe. And so we're going to talk about something a little different today. This is not uh, our normal live stream where we answer questions back and forth. We may get to some questions later. But for now, we wanted to go over something. So this video is specific to kind of VA's TERA process. And a lot of you may not know what that is. So if I can just take a moment to put that into perspective for you. Most people by now have heard of the PACT Act. Okay. It was passed in August of 2022. It created numerous presumptions of service connection for a number of cancers related to things like burn pits and other exposures in Iraq and Afghanistan. It also expanded some herbicide information. So it did a lot of things. One of the things that it did was create this process called TERA, T-E-R-A. It stands for Toxic Exposure Risk Activity. All right. And so what they kind of framed it off the old radiation risk activity. And what it basically does is tell VA to determine whether a veteran has participated in a toxic exposure risk activity, or TERA. Okay. And as with most things complicated in VA, it has not gone well. When the legislation was being worked up, I didn't like the process. I was against it. But it only because I was afraid it was going to be overly complicated to implement from a VA leadership perspective. Once you get down to 57 VA regional offices, that's always the 800-pound gorilla in the room when we're doing something like this inside VA. And so, what is a TERA process or a TERA activity? Obviously, if you are, for example, a Vietnam veteran exposed to Agent Orange, then you participated in a toxic exposure risk activity. Any of the situations where you are presumed exposed to something that's dangerous and there are disabilities related to that presumption, then that's a TERA process. Now, in reality, VA doesn't really need to go through the TERA process for those types of claims because you are presumed exposed, but they go through the TERA process anyway. So why has it become sort of a monster? Okay. When VA implemented the PACT Act, and they're still trying to figure out ways to best implement the PACT Act, there's tons of letters and instructions and manuals, and internally in VA there's a lot of information there. Wasn't much information on how to figure out what a TERA process is. So the people it's really designed, or at least that has the potential to help the most, are those that have not served somewhere where they are presumed exposed to a certain thing. Okay. In other words, if you have an MOS-based exposure, a military occupational specialty based exposure, for example, if you were an aircraft mechanic, and that's a pretty good example. Most aircraft mechanics are, especially if you served a number of years ago, were continuously exposed to things like synthetic oils, hydraulic fluids, and even more fuels, JP5, JP4, maybe MOGAS. And what about cleaning the aircraft? Solvents, TCE. The military used to use TCE in buckets They would get it in 5-gallon cans, pure TCE that used to be used as a solvent to degrease things and clean things and all. We know now that TCE is a relatively dangerous chemical. It was one of those in the Camp Lejeune drinking water, and it's known to cause a number of things. So, an aircraft mechanic who may have been exposed to all of that stuff and more would have participated in an MOS-based toxic exposure risk activity. So, the PACT Act kind of told VA to take this TERA process, look at the total exposures that someone may have had, and obtain a medical opinion. If we're getting down just to the claims process and how it works, obtain a medical opinion that informs an examiner of all of the exposures, right? And what's the potential synergistic effect of all of those exposures? And is it as likely as not that the total number of those exposures or any single one of them uh, actually caused the disability that they're claiming? So it becomes more important when you're not talking about a presumption of exposure or a presumption of service connection, because that's really what it targets the most. Now, in that, TERA process, the PACT Act also told VA to use what's now called the ILER, ILER, which stands for Individual Longitudinal Exposure Record. That is a record strictly from DOD. Okay, DOD's been working on being able to develop this longitudinal exposure record that's supposed to be individualized for a number of years, starting early in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It took them quite a while, but now they have the ILER up and running. Now, if you are a Vietnam veteran, you're not going to have an ILER. Okay, they just didn't have. They weren't able to track exposures on an individual basis back then. And trust me, they're not really able to do it now, and at least not very good. But so part of this process is VA is supposed to obtain an ILER from DOD if one exists for veterans military records. You're not going to find these inside your own service records or service medical records or anything like that. It's not something that you can FOIA, unless it's in VA's claims file. But DOD gives VA, take an Iraq or Afghanistan veteran, for example, or a Gulf War I veteran. They give them this ILA report, and this report supposedly tells VA, hey, this person might have been exposed to A, B, C, or D in this theater of operations. The ILA report, now remember, this is strictly DOD information, right? This ILA report may go a little further and say, well, based on what we think these exposures were, there is a cancer risk value and there may also be a non-cancer risk value, and that's basically a number that DOD assigns to a potential exposure on the likelihood that there's a risk of cancer or non-cancer disability resulting from that exposure. So at least in some of the Gulf War I and forward vets, you kind of got a dual thing. You've got the TERA and the ILER. But for all vets, even back in Vietnam and beyond, you may still have the TERA. That's strictly a VA process. So that's it in a nutshell. That's that's the purpose of it. How it works internally, just my opinion, not gone well. All right, so let's take the purpose of the TERA. Look at all the exposures and determine whether the synergistic effect of all those exposures may or may not have caused a disability. Well, VA's not doing that very well. So let's take the aircraft mechanic, for example. We see, in fact, we've seen plenty of aircraft mechanics, or could be vehicle mechanics. The TERA memo that goes in the file will simply tell VA and the examiner and whoever else looks at it that the TERA exposure was, quote, aircraft mechanic. That's it. That's the whole TERA. That's the conclusion of the TERA memo. Yeah, the exposures were aircraft mechanic. Well, that doesn't tell an examiner or anybody else anything about an exposure. All right. So that memo then goes to these examiners, and the examiner will craft out a medical opinion of the synergistic effect of aircraft mechanic is less likely than not the cause of these disabilities. And nowhere do they acknowledge that that aircraft mechanic is exposed to fuels, is exposed to TCE, hydraulic fluids, lubricants, any number of things. All right. Doesn't get into it. All right. So that, in my opinion, just completely defeats the purpose of the TERA. All right. And I don't put that on the heels of VA employees working these cases. I put that on the right at the feet of VA leadership for implementing this process that's just at a 10,000 foot level. All right. And so let's take this a little further. I have a blank TERA memo here that VA uses. And I think it's maybe up on the screen. So, and the whole thing's only a couple pages. So one of the first questions, the first question is does the veteran qualify for a presumption of exposure for one or more of the following hazards during active service? And you've got 4 blocks there. One, it's a yes or no question, and then you've got herbicide agent, TCDD. I'll get to that. Radiation, mustard gas, nitrogen, sulfur, mustard, lewisite, and the Camp Lejeune contamination. That's it. So that's what VA considers the presumptions of exposure. There's a whole lot of problems with this. Okay. And beyond that, it goes to ask about statutes, certain statutes, 1117, 1119. Those are your Gulf War vets, your burn pit exposed victims in Iraq and Afghanistan. But those are presumptions. Okay. Those are presumptions of exposure, which should be up in this area and should tell VA what all those exposures consisted of. Right. I'm going to digress for a second and explain what I mean. If you've got burn pit exposure, well, I was part of a group 12, 13 years, 14 years ago now, that created VA training policy on how to adjudicate claims on burn pit exposure. And we listed every single chemical that we knew, right, burn pits produced, so that the examiners could look at every single one of those individual chemicals. That doesn't happen here. You would think, all right, Congress has now made a law that says, all right, these are presumed exposures. Yeah, if you get one of these cancers, you're going to get benefits. But what about if you get Parkinson's or MS or any number of autoimmune diseases? Could they be related to these exposures? Well, it's the same thing with the aircraft mechanic. The development will read burn pit exposure without ever telling the examiner or the rater or anybody what that actually means. Right? What is burn pit exposure? There's only, I don't know, 3 dozen carcinogens that's produced by those burn pits or more, but none of that detailed information is in here. Okay. So right off the bat, the whole purpose of getting an informed medical opinion based on known exposures, or at least exposures that VA should be conceding or are presumed, is useless. Okay. But so let me stop digressing and go back to does a veteran qualify for a presumption of exposure? And I'm just going to touch on the first one there. It says herbicide agent 2378 tetrachlorodibenzoyl-dioxin. That is the dioxin contaminant that's in Agent Orange. All right. But that's not all. Okay. That is just the dioxin contaminant. Right now, if you're in Vietnam, you're presumed exposed to that contaminant, but you're also presumed exposed to all things that are herbicide agents. And the problem with this is that's not the only herbicide agent. Okay. Uh, the VA's regulations define what herbicide agents are, and they are specifically 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, and its contaminant, this dioxin, cocadylic acid, and picloram. Those are the agents that made up all the rainbow herbicides in Vietnam. Okay. Um, Yet those agents are not listed on here. Okay. Um, you would think if it's in VA's own regulations is what a herbicide agent is, and the presumption is based on all those things. And this is for the purposes of getting a medical opinion. If you need one, let's say it's not a presumptive disease, the doctor looks at this and goes, well, you're exposed to dioxin, but yeah, the veteran was also exposed to cocadylic acid, which is 30-some% arsenic. It was exposed to the other agents that made up Agent Orange, which is 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. It was exposed to herbicide white, which is the cocadylic acid, which is not used anymore. This is just incomplete. Okay. If you're a Fort McClellan veteran, and I know you don't get a presumption of exposure, but we try like hell to ensure that VA has enough info to look at the file and realize what those exposures were. They go beyond this dioxin. None of that is in here. Okay. Um, so, and you can go down, if you can pause that, or if you have a copy yourself, you can look at what some of these other questions are. Is there an individual longitudinal exposure record for the veteran? Okay, so right off the bat, yeah, I tied the ISER to the TERA. That's a yes or no. If you were in service a number of years, more than a couple of decades ago, you're not going to have a TERA. If you never left the states, and there could be lots of reasons you wouldn't have an ISER, I should say, in your record. So, and a VA is not supposed to take the ISER as the word of God. That doesn't mean you were or were not exposed just because there is or is not an ISER in your record. Right? It does ask if the ISER concedes, that you were exposed to something. Now, this is a newer version of this memo. It just came out a few weeks ago. It's not changed very much from the old version. The old version has been used for the past couple of years. Ask if the ISER actually shows exposure beyond the military exposure guidelines. So it limit now. Do you think DOD is going to acknowledge that you were exposed to something beyond their exposure guidelines? No, we'll get to that. And it goes on to ask if the veteran is a 1117 veteran, 1119 veteran. 1117 is a statute for Gulf War veterans, Gulf War I. That includes Iraq and Afghanistan and a number of other places. It asks about 1119. That's the statute that was created by the PACT Act for burn pit exposure or other exposures specific to serving in Iraq, Afghanistan, the global war on terror. And at the very end of this, a lot of times what we'll see in these cases, the whole thing is blank, except or answered in the negative, I should say. And until you get down to conclusion, did the veteran participate in a TERA? And it'll say yes. But at no time in the entire memo does it explain what that TERA was. Or, like I said earlier, it will simply say aircraft mechanic, which does not explain what that process is. So, yeah, I'm beating up on VA. That's kind of what this video is about, because it's maddening when you're working on these cases and that there are defined exposures that this process could bring out and ensure that VA develops the case based on those known exposures. But by the time that this gets to the rater or the examiner, they don't know anything more than they did prior to the PACT Act. it's just useless information. Okay.
So
That's not,
Kerry, let me ask you. So you know that this is now part of the PACT Act. And when there is some kind of disease that's non-presumptive and it's required to do this TERA memo, who at VA is the person that does this? Where does it get sent to? Or is it just someone in the file that looks at service records and goes, oh, I see Vietnam service. Yes, herbicides. Oh, I see deployment. Yes, burn pits. Who fills this out at VA?
yeah.
And where are they getting that information from? I think that's important for our veterans to know and understand, and the veterans watching, because I think that will help segue into talking about specifics and how to get information into your file that does confirm the actual exposures that you had. So who fills this out?
That is a very, very good question. All right. So VA has this office, not really an office, but they call it an office, called the RRC, or Records Research Center. Okay. This center was created a few years ago when DOD closed its version of the same office. There used to be an office, an actual office in DOD, that if VA needed to go out and verify exposures to, say, herbicide agents outside of Vietnam or something, or verify combat stressors, or something like that, that needed where VA needed some info from DOD, this office was there, and that's who they would go to. DOD closed that office, and VA took over that process. All right. And so this kind of goes back to the blue, if I can digress, but it kind of goes back to the Blue Water Navy development. Okay. And so that's about when this office was created. And their purpose at that point in time was to decide whether a veteran's naval vessel that they were on during the Vietnam War went within 12 miles of the Vietnamese border, or it did not go within 12 miles, because the Blue Water Rule said if you were within 12 miles, then you were technically in Vietnam and you were exposed to herbicide agents. And so that's what this office started doing. VA come out with policy, internal policy, that said no one but this Records Research Center can make these decisions. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. One, who are they? The short answer is they're VSRs that work around various spots in the country. They might be managed by one or two spots, but they're certainly not centralized in an office. They just get assigned these issues and say, all right, do this, do the records research and tell us if the ship was in the blue water, or in this case, what's the TERA? What's the exposure? One humongous problem with limiting that decision to those folks, and we don't know how they're trained. We know they're just typical VA employees who have been assigned this function. I'm sure there's some training on researching military records, but at the end of the day, these are DoD VSR employees who had, assuming, some bit of training. But you appeal, let's say they nope, you weren't exposed, and you appeal that decision to a decision review officer who has statutory de novo review authority over that case. That means by laws passed by Congress, that DRO has de novo review. In other words, they get to look at that case anew and give no deference to anybody else that made a decision in that case. They get to decide it themselves. Well, they can't, because VA has created this internal policy that says you can't change their decision. You can't change the RRC's decision. And these people making this are not decision makers. So the problems are everywhere with how VA leadership has chosen to implement this process. Now, if you try to contact these folks, good luck. We have not been able to actually contact these folks. There's no anywhere, there's nowhere in VA's publicly disclosed information that tells us who these folks are, what the chain of command is, what the training is, you know, and I'm sure it exists, but this should be something that's more transparent to us, and it's not. So hopefully that answered the question, Ursula.
It did. So I know from what I see a lot is it's just someone going through the file and noting where someone served, and whether or not, you know, the presumptive, the burn pits, that stuff's going to show up. But it really does come into some of the other toxic activities when we are dealing with MOS. We are dealing with those types of chemicals that not everybody would have been, or a combination of the two. So if you were in burn pits and you had this horrible MOS that was really dangerous, you know, sometimes they miss one or the other. And that's really what the medical examiner is supposed to look at and say, oh, we were exposed to burn pits here. And in addition, because of the MOS, we've got all of these other exposures combined. Could they have caused this non-presumptive condition? That's the way the policy was written and how it's supposed to work. What we've seen with VA is that this is not how it's playing out. The way that it's playing out is literally someone goes through, they say yes, 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 no, MOS, you know, aircraft mechanic, and it gets sent off. And like Carrie said, those examiners don't always know all the things that an aircraft mechanic was exposed to. And so there's a big issue. It's almost like there's a whole step missing when it comes to this TERA. It's like, okay, get a TERA. Yes, there's a TERA. Now, what are those chemicals? And then send that to the examiner. And that's the part that VA is not doing. And so these examiners don't have enough information, and claims are getting denied. One thing I want to say real quick, I can see the comments that are coming through. And I'm seeing a lot of you guys saying, I was service connected due to TERA. You weren't service connected due to TERA. You were service connected due to exposure to chemicals, either through burn pits, where you served, or your MOS. So keep that in mind. It's not. So that's why you may have been service connected for some things due to the TERA, due to the exposures on your military service, but then not granted something like carpal tunnel syndrome because there's no link between your exposure to whatever it was and carpal tunnel syndrome. So don't think of TERA as an actual, don't get it confused. TERA is just a process that VA says were you exposed to harmful chemicals. It's not an actual tangible thing.
And that's not to say that the TERA process has not benefited some veterans, because it has. I mean, we've seen plenty of grants based on this. It wasn't because of the thoroughness of the process. It's, you know, when this initially rolled out, I think it was probably a little bit better than it is today, but VA is kind of fallen back into that. You know, sometimes the TERA memo will say, yes, there's a TERA, doesn't say what it is. And the examiner, when it gets to that portion, and they craft these sometimes stock made medical opinions, it will say unknown. Yeah, the TERA exposures are unknown. And yet the examiner doesn't send that back to ask what the exposures were. They just keep repeating the word unknown and give their negative medical opinion, which is clearly a duty to assist violation. But it also goes a little deeper than that. Let's just take a Fort McClellan case, for example. You know, we have, we're not the only ones. There's a significant amount of official evidence that shows what toxins were on Fort McClellan. All right, and when they were there and how much they were used. When we work on a Fort McClellan case, we try to put all of that information in the record. And then they send it through a TERA process. The TERA will say, you know, Fort McClellan, doesn't say anything about what the exposures were. or it'll say, no, you weren't, you did not participate in a TERA. And they'll base that on a little bit, the RRC, the Records Research Center, will go out and do a little bit of research on their pre-approved websites or their information they have in-house and say, nope, you weren't exposed to anything. When there's a plethora of evidence right inside the claims file that they never look at. It's
just
almost, I really want to put my head through a wall
a
sometimes.
consistency
When,
issue.
when you give them the evidence and they look everywhere else but the evidence that you gave them, and they come out and say, nope, you weren't exposed to anything. It's like, wake up, look in the file. We gave it to you for a reason. We understand you weren't able to find it in your little research, but we have found it and we provided it to you. So look in the file.
It's definitely, especially with the Fort McClellan veterans that we have, I mean, there is absolutely no consistency on the TERAs at all. There are some that I have seen well-written TERAs. Those are few and far between, where it'll say, yes, there's another exposure, Fort McClellan, herbicides, blah, blah, blah. And they'll say, talk about the evidence that we've submitted. Those people get a positive TERA. That information, because those chemicals are listed on the TERA, when the medical opinion gets asked, they can see those exposures and they're like, oh yeah, absolutely, these conditions are due to that. And then they're going through on this initial claim that we're first filing or the initial appeal with the evidence. But then the exact same evidence, goes in for another Fort McClellan and it'll just say, no TERA, nothing there. And so it's frustrating. We've even had times where a TERA goes in, it's positive. It says, yes, there was definitely an exposure. VA requests another TERA and it comes back negative. Oh, no, sorry, no exposure. And then they take that negative TERA and use that to deny claims as well. So it's really just depends on who's looking at it. And what's frustrating, for us is going, okay, well, now we've got all these different TERAs, but for veterans that don't have advocates who can get into the claims file, you're not going to see these unless you ask for them. And even if you do ask for it and you get it, I don't know what the process is in order to get it corrected unless you just get additional evidence in and take it to the board. But you're stuck waiting. At that point, you're going to be waiting, 3 years for a decision unless you can get an advancement on the docket. And so there's a lot of issues with the TERA, and that's kind of, what Carrie's trying to bring home is that things need to change with this whole process because people are being denied claims because VA is unable to actually document the chemicals and exposures that each veteran has gone through.
And another big problem, not necessarily with the TERA, but when it's used, we will inevitably file a claim or appeal a claim for hearing loss and tinnitus, and I'm just using that as an example. And what happens? VA goes and develops for a TERA. All right, your hearing loss and your tinnitus have a pretty large odds of not being related to a toxic exposure. All right, but let's just take it a little bit further. You blew out your knee, during a unit run. What do we see? VA goes out and gets a TERA. Was the broken knee caused by a toxic exposure? Come on, wake up. All right. Now, VA has put instructions out that, hey, look, you don't need to use a TERA for every single claim that's in VA, but that's almost literally what was happening, at least initially, and still to this day. I don't know how many cases we have where we spell out what the theory of the service connection claim is. It goes to development and it gets a TERA process when it has nothing to do with it. And then we get a medical opinion that completely ignores the basis of the claim and denies it because the TERA is negative. And we have to go right back and get it fixed. Again, wake up, VA. All right, you can't just put a few paragraphs together in your high level instruction and think everybody in the field is instantly going to follow that. Right? You need to step up and be leaders, uh, and provide a little bit of better instruction to the field. Now, I want to get into the ISER. DOD. Hopefully, a rock guy will not get dropped on my house here. Um, I'm not too far from Fort Campbell. The one entity that might make VA look nice. Uh, so I have an ISER. We can't share it with you. It's got personal information on it, and we can't. I haven't figured out where to just pull one of these down, a blank one to show you. They're going to be different depending on where the veteran served. This one is a Gulf War veteran. Okay. Um, if I'll just assume you might not be that familiar with the first Gulf War. Um, there were at one point in time, and during the Gulf War One in 1991, there were hundreds of large oil wells set ablaze. Okay, um, and and so these things were spewing oil out that was on fire. Every single one across, I don't know everyone, but it looked like everyone. I mean, I was there. I flew through these things. I saw them from a bird's eye view. Um, it looked like all of them were on fire. And if you ever saw an oil well on fire, it spews solid black smoke just way up into the sky. Um, at least right there in the where the ground war was happening, and right in this area where all the oil wells were, it, middle of the day looked like it was the middle of the night. The entire sky was blacked out. Um, you would, we had our visors down when we flew helicopters, and your face beneath the visor was black by the time you were done. You were breathing in lots of that smoke that was coming off those oil well fires. And that's just the one example. I know there's others, but so what do you get when you breathe in, or when you burn oil, or what does oil have in it? It has benzene. Okay, and then all kinds of benzene-like products, ethyl benzene, xylene, all kinds of enes, all right, that come from this stuff, but they're all more. Let's just use benzene as an example. And so this ISER, again from DOD, acknowledges benzene uh, and a number of benzene-related products. And I told you earlier that this thing gives a cancer risk value and a non-cancer risk value. Now and so just for benzene, okay, it doesn't tell us where this person was in relation to the Gulf War, and I'll get to what I mean by that. But the cancer risk value, I'm gonna try to read you this number. It's 2.6 capital E -08. What kind of number is that? Well, that it's written that way, and I'm no mathematician, because it's so small of a value, they need to come up with a formula to express it. Um, and if you took that and put it in a calculator online to tell you what that number was, it's got about a decimal point followed by like 9 zeros and the number 26. I don't know, that it's like 26 quadrillionth of a percent that you have a cancer risk value from this benzene exposure. Right. Went over this with John Stewart at one point, and he made a it was pretty funny. He said you have a higher cancer risk value by sitting next to a McDonald's cheeseburger, and that's about right. Okay, that number is so tiny, so small, it's laughable. Now here's the rub. we don't know where this veteran was, right? But we've seen plenty of these Gulf War I ISERs. It stands for individual longitudinal exposure record. Yet every single one has that same cancer risk value. Whether that veteran was sitting right next to a burning oil well or whether they were 200 miles south of the burning oil well, every single one has the same cancer risk value. It gets worse. So let's go to the next toxin on the list, ethyl benzene. Oh, look, it's the same number. Well, it can't continually be the same number. Let's go to the next one. These are hard to read, they're small. Xylene. Oh, look, it's the same number too. Let's see here. Naphthalene. Oh, dang, it's the same number too. Naphthalene, we used to use that as a degreaser. And on and on and on and on, they're all the same number. So it doesn't matter what you were exposed to, your cancer risk value is it's like one of those numbers that you get from outer space. It's so tiny that your mind can't get wrapped around it. And it's that for every single toxin that you were exposed to. And it's that way for every single veteran, regardless of where they were, how much they were exposed. All right. That is an absolute joke.
Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense.
And we've got it in black and white in every single ISER from the Gulf War. So do you think you're going to get anything different if it's an ISER from Iraq and Afghanistan? Now, the chemicals are going to be a little bit different, but if you think DOD is going to go out there and say, yeah, this person might have been exposed to what we consider over the military exposure guideline, you can damn near forget it. All right, and this is the information. Now, it just happened that this, this particular case, the TERA memo, the only spot that mentions benzene is the question about Camp Lejeune. All right, but it does ask benzene specifically, and the answer to that question was no, when the TERA memo gave benzene as practically the only exposure that the guy was exposed to. So, it's frustrating to see people work on these issues for 15, 20 years, and this is what it comes out to look like at the end for a veteran getting a rating decision and wondering what is it that makes up this decision, this denial, and to know that that's all it is, that's the attention to detail that was put into this. So I'm sure, I'm not going to be so arrogant to assume VA leadership watches us on this, but I hope they do. You need to do better, right? You really need to do better on this. So that's kind of the process in a nutshell, at least the part that we kind of wanted to talk about. We see this so much, we get frustrated, and we just wanted to let you know about it. It's sometimes what we're up against on claims based on exposure. Now, I'm not knocking the PACT Act. The PACT Act was probably the single biggest piece of positive legislation that probably I've ever seen. The intent behind this TERA process was good, but it was, not to knock on some service orgs, but that's who wanted this process, and it was not well thought out by them. And this takes considerable administration, if you will, to get right. And it's not been gotten right and I don't see it getting right anytime in the future. So not to bring you down, you know, you know, but it's important that you know what you're up against. It's important that if you're doing the stuff on your own and you know what the exposures were, get that in the record, because at some point somebody's going to listen. You know, you might have to go to the Board of Veterans Appeals. You might have to wait on that appeal, but get the actual toxins that you know of into the record and make sure that you address it as such that, you know, their development process did not cover all this. And if those cases are denied by the board, you've got a pretty good shot at getting that denial kicked out by the court. But you've probably got just a better of a shot at getting the board to go, now we're not going to deny this claim because you clearly didn't do this the right way and didn't consider what the exposures were. So go back and do it again. You know, so.
And if you are on your own and you want to try to get a nexus, I would suggest trying to get a doctor that specializes in occupational medicine. There are some out there that do military occupations, but they should all be able to do it. And what they would be able to, like, if you can really line out what your day was like getting a statement that says aircraft mechanic or, you know, radio technician, whatever your MOS was, go in and get a statement in that talks about a day in the life of what you did, how you did that, what chemicals you used, under what circumstances, how many hours a day you did that job. And so that way it can show that, okay, you were around these chemicals all the time, or you were, you know, just get that in there. If you need a medical opinion, which hopefully you don't, again, an occupational medicine doctor would be the best. They are qualified to know what your job was, what chemicals you were exposed to, and whether or not those chemicals led to the development of whatever conditions you have. And I will say, just from experience, when the regional office starts digging their heels in on the TERA and saying you weren't exposed, it is just better to go to the board sometimes, because they're not going to do it. They're not going to grant it. They're not going to look outside of their little box in their M21 and really make any real decisions that make sense, whereas the board can. So don't spin your wheels at the regional office hoping to get somewhere if you find out that it's just not going anywhere.
Yeah, and I see some comments on the side that talk about, well, my condition is service connected, or some comments like that. It's important to draw a distinction here. Regardless if you got a negative TERA process or a positive one, if your condition is service connected, then the TERA process, as far as that condition goes, is irrelevant at that point. You know, the only thing that matters then is how have they rated the disability. Once it's service connected, doesn't matter how it got there, whether it was through TERA or some other means. That's kind of irrelevant at that point. So don't mix those two up. If you've got something that's service connected and you can't get the rating you think you need, that's not because of a TERA process. That's just because VA is underrating it, or it could be a number of things. But that all has to do with purely rating the disability. The TERA process is all about, you know, getting to service connection or not getting to it. Beyond that, you know, it's a rating issue after that. So hopefully everybody got something out of that. You know, if you're one of those studious folks that likes to, you know, shake the tree in Congress or in VA, then shake it. Use this info and shake it. You know, however you choose. But we're going to keep fighting these issues the best we can. They're sometimes not too hard, sometimes exceptionally difficult. And we will probably pick another topic down the road that we want to bitch and complain about, and do another one of these episodes. So let us know.
Let us know what you want to talk about. If you want to talk about something about the TERA more in depth, let us know. Or if there's something that you're just confused about that we can help with, let us know. And we can get on here and try to get some questions answered.
All right. Well, and sorry we didn't really get questions, answered, but this is more of an information video more than anything else. So, all right.
All right, thank you guys. We'll see you soon, I'm sure. Bye.